The summer I turned 12, my dad got a new assignment. He's a paleontologist, which is a fancy way of saying he digs up old bones. And this time, we were going to Greece. Not the postcard Greece with white houses and blue domes, but the kind of Greece that's all scrubby hills and sun-baked rock way up in the north. He said we were going to a place called Ouranos, which sounded pretty cool, like something out of a myth. He explained it was where they found the first fossils of something called Ouranopithecus, and the name meant Ouranos ape. I pictured a big hairy guy with a toga, which made me giggle. We spent the first few weeks just getting settled. Our home was a small, dusty house near a village, and the air smelled of thyme and dry earth. Dad would spend all day out at the dig site, coming back covered in a fine layer of dust, his face etched with a mix of exhaustion and pure excitement. He'd bring me small pieces of rock or a tiny fossilized leaf he'd found, and he'd tell me stories about the world they came from. That's when the real adventure started for me. I wasn't just a kid in a dusty village anymore. I was a time traveler, a detective, trying to piece together a picture from 1,000,000 years ago. The first big story he told me was about the discovery itself. It was in the 1970s, and a team of paleontologists were working in the same area we were. They were looking for ancient animals, but they weren't expecting to find what they did. One day, a guy named Louis de Bonis, a French paleontologist, was examining a piece of rock and saw something that didn't look like a typical animal tooth. It was bigger, and the shape was different. It was a molar, a big chewing tooth, and it was the first piece of Ouranopithecus ever found. Dad said it was a moment of pure serendipity, like finding a secret message in a bottle. From just that one tooth, they knew they had something new, something special. He explained how it works. When a creature dies, its soft parts decay, but sometimes its bones get buried under layers of sediment. Mud, sand, volcanic ash, and over millions of years, the minerals in the water seep into the bones, turning them to stone. This process is called fossilization. It's a bit like turning a sandcastle into concrete. The bones become fossils, and they hold a record of that animal, a snapshot in time. Dad said that finding a fossil is like opening a book with a single, blurry page. It gives you a hint, but you have to keep looking for more pages to understand the whole story. The next big find was a skull. Not a whole one, of course, because that's incredibly rare, but a fragment of a face, including a jawbone. This was the real game changer. With a jawbone, they could tell so much more. They could see the shape of the teeth, the size of the jaw, the way the muscles would have attached. Dad explained that the teeth were a treasure trove of information. The molars of Ouranopithecus were huge, and they had thick enamel, the hard stuff on the outside of your teeth. That told the scientists a lot about what it ate. Thick enamel is great for grinding up tough, fibrous food, like hard fruits, nuts, or seeds. So they knew this ancient ape wasn't just munching on soft leaves, it was a powerful chewer, a real cruncher. The jawbone also had something really interesting. A gap between the incisors and the canine teeth, a space called a diastema. This is a characteristic feature in many apes, including gorillas and chimpanzees, and it's there to accommodate the large canine teeth of the opposite jaw. It's like a special parking spot for a big tooth. Dad said this was another clue that Ouranopithecus was an ape, but not just any ape. The shape of the jaw and the teeth were different enough to put it in a whole new category. They were looking at a new branch on the family tree of life. The most exciting part for me was when Dad started talking about the brain. You don't find fossilized brains, of course, but the skull fragment gave them a pretty good idea of the brain size. The brain case, the part of the skull that holds the brain, was relatively small, similar in size to a modern chimpanzee. So, they knew this ape wasn't a super genius. It was smart for sure, but not like us. It was a creature of its time, perfectly adapted to its environment. Dad also told me about the environment itself. He said that when Ouranopithecus was alive, about 9 or 10 million years ago, this part of Greece wasn't the dry, scrubby landscape it is today. It was a lush, subtropical forest. It would have been warm and humid, with a dense canopy of trees. There would have been rivers and lakes, and the place would have been teeming with life. He told me about the other animals they found fossils of. Ancient giraffes with short necks, hippos, a kind of rhino, and even giant saber-toothed cats. It was a whole different world, a real-life jungle book. Ouranopithecus would have lived, in the trees, swinging from branch to branch, but also probably spent a lot of time on the ground, foraging for food. It was a mix of a tree dweller and a ground dweller, a bit like a modern gorilla, Dad explained. The final piece of the puzzle, for me, was when he told me about the name itself, Ouranopithecus macedoniensis. The Macedoniensis part came from where it was found, Macedonia, a region in northern Greece. It was a name that told a whole story on its own. A story of a place and a time, a story of an ancient ape that lived and died millions of years ago, its bones turning to stone and waiting for us to find them. I started to see the rocks around our house not just as rocks, but as potential treasure chests, each one holding a secret from the past. And I couldn't wait to hear more. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought of all those ancient animals walking right where our dusty little house was now felt a bit like magic. I kept picturing Ouranopithecus, not as a dusty museum exhibit, but as a living creature. I imagined it with a thick coat of dark brown fur, long arms and powerful hands, its face a mix of serious and curious as it peered down from a tree branch. I pictured the ancient giraffes, not the tall, lanky ones you see in zoos, but shorter, stockier versions, munching on leaves. I imagined the saber-toothed cats, their fangs glinting in the sun, stalking through the undergrowth. The next morning, Dad took me to the dig site. It wasn't what I expected. I thought it would be a huge pit, like something you'd see in a movie, but it was a series of smaller trenches, carefully dug into the side of a low hill. The ground was a reddish-brown color, and everywhere you looked, there were small white flags marking where something important had been found. Dad explained that they had to be incredibly careful. It wasn't like just digging for treasure. It was a painstaking process of sifting through dirt, gently brushing away layers of earth, and documenting every single thing they found. It was more like detective work than digging. He showed me a piece of rock that had a fossilized turtle shell embedded in it. It was so perfect, you could still see the pattern on the shell. He told me that this wasn't just a fossil of a turtle. It was a clue. The type of turtle, the kind of rock it was found in, all of that helped them build a picture of the ancient environment. This particular turtle liked living in freshwater ponds, so they knew there must have been a pond or a small lake nearby. Every fossil was a tiny piece of a massive jigsaw puzzle. We sat down under a small awning to get out of the sun, and Dad pulled out a sketchbook. He was a pretty good artist, and he started sketching what Ouranopithecus might have looked like. He drew a creature with a wide, robust face, a flat nose, and a powerful jaw. He gave it a low, sloping forehead and a big brow ridge, the bony part above your eyes. He explained that these features were all based on the skull fragments they had found. The big brow ridge, for example, was a feature of many ancient apes and early hominids, and it was a sign of a very powerful chewing muscle. The muscles attached to the top of the head and connected to the jaw, giving them a vice-like grip. He also drew the teeth, showing me the massive molars with their thick enamel. He pointed to the jawbone he had sketched, showing me the places where the chewing muscles would have attached, and he explained that the whole jaw was built like a powerful grinding machine. It was built to chew and chew and chew, to break down tough plant material. He said that this kind of jaw and teeth told them that Ouranopithecus wasn't just a casual grazer. It was a specialist, adapted to a particular diet. But then, he drew something that really caught my attention. He drew its hands. We don't have fossilized hands of Ouranopithecus, but he explained that based on the other features, scientists could make some educated guesses. He drew hands with long, curved fingers, the kind that would be perfect for grasping branches and swinging through trees. He said that while they probably spent a lot of time on the ground, their anatomy suggested they were still very comfortable in the trees. They were probably excellent climbers, able to move through the forest canopy with ease. He also started talking about its body size. Again, they don't have a full skeleton, but based on the size of the skull and jaw, they could estimate. He said that Ouranopithecus was probably a pretty big ape, maybe the size of a modern gorilla or even a bit bigger. He drew a sketch of it standing, and it was a powerful hunched figure with broad shoulders and a muscular build. He said that this was another clue that it was a ground dweller as much as a tree dweller. A big, heavy body is harder to move through the treetops, so it would have spent a lot of its time on the forest floor foraging for food. The debate Dad talked about really stuck with me. The idea that Ouranopithecus could be a direct ancestor of ours, a sort of great-great-great-great-grandfather, was mind-blowing. It made me look at the world around me differently. I started seeing the scrubby hills as a place of immense historical importance, a stage where a crucial act of our own origin story might have played out. It wasn't just a place where some old apes lived. It was a place where our own family tree might have taken a surprising and unexpected turn. One afternoon, Dad came back from the dig site with a huge smile on his face. He was holding a small plastic bag, and inside was a single perfect tooth. "Look at this," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement. He carefully laid the tooth out on a clean white cloth. It was a lower canine, a big pointy tooth from the front of the jaw. He explained that canine teeth in most apes are very large and are often used for display or as weapons in a fight. But this one was different. It was smaller than what you'd expect for a male ape of that size. He said it was more incisiform, meaning it looked more like an incisor, the flat teeth we have in the front of our mouths. He told me this was a really big deal. It was a clue about the social life of Ouranopithecus. In many species of primates, a big difference in canine tooth size between males and females is a sign of a lot of competition between males for mates. The bigger, more aggressive males would have bigger canines to fight with. But if the canines were smaller and more incisor-like, it suggested that the social structure might have been different. It could mean less competition and aggression among the males. It hinted at a more peaceful, maybe even monogamous, social structure. It was a tiny piece of bone. But it was telling us a story about how they lived, how they interacted with each other, and what their family life might have been like. He also talked about the wear on the teeth. He showed me a photograph of a molar that had been studied under a microscope. It had tiny scratches and pits on the surface. These weren't from the fossilization process. They were from millions of years of chewing. He explained that these marks were like a food diary. The scratches suggested they were eating tough, fibrous plant material, and the pits hinted at harder objects like seeds or nuts. It confirmed the theory they had about the thick enamel, that this ape was a powerful chewer, a kind of prehistoric nutcracker. The most profound part of his explanation was when he started talking about the climate. He said that around 9 million years ago, the climate was starting to change. The lush, subtropical forests were beginning to shrink, and the open woodlands and grasslands were starting to expand. This was a massive environmental shift, and it was forcing animals to adapt or die. He said that Ouranopithecus was living right in the middle of this change. Its powerful teeth and robust jaw were perfect for this new environment, where the food was tougher and the trees were more scattered. It was a creature that was perfectly designed for a changing world. He explained that this change was a key part of the larger story of human evolution. He said that many scientists believe that the shift from forests to grasslands was one of the major drivers of the evolution of bipedalism, walking on two legs. When the trees became more scattered, it became more efficient to walk on the ground, to get from one food source to another. He wasn't saying that Ouranopithecus was bipedal, because there was no fossil evidence of that. But he was saying that it was living in the right place, at the right time, for the seeds of bipedalism to be planted. It was a fascinating and almost poetic connection. The changing landscape of Greece 9 million years ago might have been setting the stage for a story that would one day lead to us. Dad then showed me some photographs of other fossils found in the same area. There was a jawbone of a giant antelope and a piece of a skull from a saber-toothed cat. He explained that these animals were all part of the same ecosystem, all living and dying in the same place. He said that the saber-toothed cats would have been a major predator for Ouranopithecus. A big, powerful ape would have been a great meal for a big, powerful cat. It gave me a new perspective. Ouranopithecus wasn't just this peaceful, family-oriented ape. It was a creature fighting for survival every single day, trying to find food and avoid becoming a meal itself. He finished his explanation by looking at the small canine tooth again. "This is why we do this," he said, his voice soft. "This little piece of bone tells us so much. It tells us about how they lived, how they ate, and how they fought. It tells us about their world, and maybe, just maybe, it tells us a little bit about our own story too." I picked up the small plastic bag and held it in my hand. It was just a tooth. But in my imagination, it was so much more. It was a piece of a story, a message from the deep past, waiting for someone to listen. And I was starting to understand. The language of the bones. One evening, as the sun was setting and the hills turned a fiery orange, Dad and I were sitting outside our house eating dinner. He had a map spread out on the table, and he was tracing a line with his finger from Greece, across what is now Turkey, and all the way down into Africa. He explained that this was the path he believed a lot of animals, including some of our ancestors, might have taken millions of years ago. It wasn't a single, straightforward journey, but a long, slow migration over thousands of years, with populations moving and spreading as the climate changed and new food sources became available. He told me about a place in Kenya called the Tugan Hills, where they found fossils of an early hominid called Ouranopithecus. It was about 6 million years old, a few million years younger than Ouranopithecus. The interesting thing about Ouran, Dad said, was that its leg bone showed clear signs of bipedalism. It was one of the earliest creatures we know of that definitely walked on 2 legs. He explained how the head of the femur, the big bone in your thigh, was shaped in a way that proved it walked upright. He said it was like finding a car part and being able to tell from the shape that it was part of a specific kind of engine. The really mind-blowing part was when Dad started comparing Ouran to Ouranopithecus. He said that some scientists believe that the features they were seeing in Ouranopithecus, the robust jaw, the thick enamel, the powerful chewing muscles, were very similar to the adaptations they were seeing in the early hominids of Africa, including Ouran. It was like a pattern, a trend that was showing up in 2 different places. This led to a big, debated theory. Could Ouranopithecus have been part of the group that migrated into Africa and eventually gave rise to these early bipedal hominids? It was a radical idea. For a long time, the prevailing theory was that human ancestors evolved entirely in Africa. But the discovery of Ouranopithecus and its surprising similarities to later African hominids suggested that the story might be more complicated. Dad said it was like thinking a story started in 1 chapter, and then finding a lost chapter at the beginning that took place somewhere else entirely. He said that the evidence from Greece wasn't enough to rewrite the entire history book, but it was enough to make everyone question what they thought they knew. He also talked about the concept of a last common ancestor. He explained that about 7 million years ago, the line that led to chimpanzees and the line that led to humans split. He said that the last common ancestor, the creature that was the great-great-great grandparent of both of us, probably looked something like Ouranopithecus. It was a creature that was part of the ancient ape family, but it was starting to show some of the traits that would eventually lead to us. The conversation made me feel like I was a part of something big. It wasn't just a story about some old ape. It was our story. It was the story of how we became who we are. The dusty ground beneath our feet wasn't just ground anymore. It was the birthplace of a question that could change the way we see ourselves. The wind that blew through the hills wasn't just wind. It was the same wind that might have once rustled the leaves of the ancient trees that Ouranopithecus called home. Dad said that this was the real purpose of his work. It wasn't just to find bones, but to find answers, to solve the mystery of our own existence. He said that every day they spent out in the sun, carefully sifting through the dirt, they were trying to piece together a story that was millions of years old. And that story, he said, was our story. It was a story of survival, of adaptation, and of a long, slow journey that started in a lush subtropical forest in northern Greece and would one day lead to a 12-year-old boy sitting with his dad, trying to understand where we all came from. And I knew right then that I wanted to be a part of that story too. The next day, Dad let me help out at the dig site. I wasn't allowed to use the big tools, of course, but he gave me a small brush and a little trowel and showed me how to carefully scrape away the dirt. He pointed to a section of the trench and told me to look for anything that wasn't just rock or dirt. He explained that a lot of times the most important finds aren't the big bones, but the small ones, like a single tooth or a tiny piece of a jaw. He said that in paleontology, patience is more important than strength. As I worked, I thought about what he had told me about the big debate, whether Ouranopithecus was a direct ancestor of ours or just a close relative. I couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to find a piece of evidence that could settle the argument. What if I found a fossilized foot bone, one that showed a clear sign of bipedalism, and it belonged to an Ouranopithecus? It would be like finding the last page of the mystery novel, the one that tells you who the killer is. It would be a moment that could change our understanding of human history forever. Dad came over and knelt beside me, watching me work. He told me a story about a specific fossil they found here, one that was a bit of a mystery. It was a partial face with a jaw and some teeth, but it was from a different site, a little further down the hill. He explained that it had some features that were a bit different from the other Ouranopithecus fossils they had found. The teeth were a little smaller, and the jaw was a bit more slender. This meant one of two things. Either it was a different species of Ouranopithecus, a new kind of ape they hadn't found before, or it was a female. He explained that in many primate species, there's a big size difference between males and females. The males are often much larger and have bigger jaws and teeth. So finding a smaller individual could just mean they had finally found a female. But he also said that it could mean something else entirely. It could mean that there was more than one kind of large ape living in this area at the same time. The ancient ecosystem could have been a busy place, with different species of apes, each with their own special diet and way of life, all living side by side. This brought up another fascinating question. If there were two species, how did they interact? Did they compete for food? Did they avoid each other? Or did they live together in a kind of ancient harmony, each with its own niche in the forest? It was a mystery that a single fossil couldn't solve, but it was a question that would drive paleontologists for years to come. As the sun got hotter, Dad suggested we take a break. We walked over to the shade of a big rock outcrop, and he started, sketching on his notepad again. This time, he was drawing the ancient landscape. He drew a river winding through the hills, with thick green forests on either side. He drew the open grasslands on the higher ground, with ancient giraffes and rhinos grazing. And he drew a small, hairy figure, an Ouranopithecus, standing on the edge of the forest, looking out at the open plain. He said that this was the real story, the one that all the bones and fossils were trying to tell them. It wasn't just about one creature, but about a whole world. A world that was constantly changing, where animals were constantly adapting, and where a small change in climate could lead to a massive change in the course of evolution. He said that Ouranopithecus wasn't just an ape. It was a symbol of that change. A creature that was perfectly adapted to a world that was disappearing, and one that might have given rise to the very creature that was perfectly adapted to the world that was to come. It was a story of hope, of survival, and of the incredible power of life to find a way, no matter what. Dad had a friend, another paleontologist named Elias, who came to visit the dig site. Elias was a lively man with a big laugh and a beard that was almost as dusty as Dad's clothes. One evening, the three of us were sitting on the porch, and Elias started telling me a story about a place called Chalkutsi on the Greek mainland, where they had found a bunch of fossils. He said that this site was special because it was a bone bed, a place where a lot of animals had died and been buried all at once, maybe by a flood or a volcanic eruption. He said that the Chalkutsi bone bed was a time capsule. It wasn't just a few bones here and there. It was a whole snapshot of the ancient ecosystem. And in this snapshot, they found something really interesting. They found fossils of a different kind of ape, a much smaller one, that lived at the same time as Ouranopithecus. They called it Mesopithecus, and it was a colobine monkey, a bit like a modern-day langur. Elias explained that Mesopithecus was a more specialized leaf eater, with a stomach that was great for digesting tough leaves. It was a creature of the trees, a real arboreal specialist. The contrast between Mesopithecus and Ouranopithecus was what made the story so cool. Here, Yahadayo had two different kinds of apes, living in the same place, at the same time, but with completely different lifestyles. Ouranopithecus was a big, powerful ground dweller and tree climber, with teeth for crunching tough, hard foods. Mesopithecus was a smaller, more agile tree dweller with a diet of soft leaves. They had different niches, different jobs in the ancient ecosystem. Elias said that this was a good example of how ecosystems work. It's not just one big animal at the top and a bunch of little animals at the bottom. It's a complex web, with all sorts of different creatures living in their own little worlds, but still connected to each other. He said that the presence of both apes told them that the landscape was a mix of different environments. There were still enough forests for the leaf-eating Mesopithecus to thrive, but there were also enough open areas for the tougher, more robust Ouranopithecus to find food. He also brought up another fascinating point. He said that this kind of diversity, this mix of different species, was a sign of a healthy ecosystem. But he also said that as the climate got drier and the forests continued to shrink, one of these apes would probably be better suited to survive than the other. He said that the more generalized animal, the one that could eat a wider variety of foods, would have a better chance of making it. He hinted that Ouranopithecus, with its powerful chewing muscles and its ability to eat both hard and soft foods, might have been the one with the better odds. This made me think about the other animals they had found. The ancient giraffes, the rhinos, the saber-toothed cats, they were all part of this same complex web. They all had their own roles to play. The saber-toothed cats would have preyed on the giraffes and rhinos, and maybe even on the big Ouranopithecus. The giraffes and rhinos would have eaten the plants, and those plants would have been competing with the food sources of the apes. It was a giant, ancient food chain, and every single fossil they found was a link in that chain. As the evening wore on, Elias and Dad started talking about the bigger picture again. They talked about how the fossil record isn't perfect. It's a bunch of scattered clues, a bunch of missing pages from the history book. They said that every fossil they find, every tooth, every bone, every tiny plant fragment, is a chance to fill in a missing piece of the story. And the story of Ouranopithecus wasn't just about a single species. It was a story about an entire world that was lost to time, a world that was being slowly and painstakingly rebuilt, one piece at a time, by the hard work of people like them. And I was lucky enough to be right in the middle of it. My time in Greece was coming to an end. The summer was winding down, and the air was starting to get a little cooler in the mornings. It felt like I had been there forever, but also like It had just begun. The dusty hills and the shimmering heat haze had become a part of me, and I felt a connection to this place that I knew I'd never forget. On our last evening, Dad and I walked up to the highest point of the hill, the place where the dig site was, and sat down to watch the sunset. The sky was on fire, and the land below was turning into a sea of deep purple shadows. He pointed out to the west, where the sun was disappearing behind a distant mountain range. "That's the direction we're headed," he said, "back home." But for a lot of animals millions of years ago, that was the direction they were coming from. He then told me the final piece of the story, the part that connected everything together. He explained that about 7 or 8 million years ago, a massive geological event happened. The land bridge that connected Eurasia and Africa began to break up and change. It wasn't a sudden thing, but a slow, gradual process of tectonic plates, shifting and mountains rising. This made it much harder for animals to move back and forth between the two continents. The populations that were in Africa were now mostly isolated from the populations that were here in Eurasia. This isolation was the key. He said that once a population is isolated, it starts to evolve on its own. The different environments, the different food sources, and the different predators all start to push the animals in different directions. The apes that were in Africa, facing a new world of shrinking forests and expanding grasslands, were forced to adapt in new ways, and it was in this new world that they started to walk on 2 legs. He said that the story of Ouranopithecus wasn't just about a single ape. It was a story about the end of an era, the end of a time when the great apes roamed freely between Eurasia and Africa. And it was also a story about a new beginning, a new chapter in the story of life. He said that while Ouranopithecus itself probably didn't walk on 2 legs, it was part of the same big family. It was a cousin, maybe a close one, that was living its own life here in Greece while our direct ancestors were starting their own incredible journey in Africa. The story was like a puzzle with 1,000 pieces, and we had only found a few of them. But those few pieces were enough to change the whole picture. They had shown us that the story of human evolution wasn't a simple straight line. It was a complex, tangled mess of different species, different places, and different times. It was a story that was still being written, and every time a paleontologist picks up a trowel, they're helping to add another word, another sentence, another chapter. He put his arm around me, and we sat there in the quiet twilight, watching the stars start to appear. "You know," he said, "a lot of people think that the past is dead and gone, but that's not true. The past is all around us, in the rocks, in the fossils, in the very ground we're sitting on. We just have to know how to listen to its stories." And as I looked out at the darkening hills, I felt like I could hear them. The whispers of the ancient winds, the rustling of the long-lost forests, the footsteps of the great apes walking through a world that was both their home and their past. I was just a kid from America, but for one summer, in a dusty corner of Greece, I had been a part of a story that was millions of years old, and I knew, deep down, that I would never see the world the same way again. My last morning in Greece, I woke up before my dad. The sun was just starting to peek over the hills, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges. I slipped on my shoes and walked outside, the air cool and fresh. The dig site was quiet, a series of trenches and piles of dirt that looked like sleeping giants in the dawn light. I walked up to the edge of the nearest trench and looked down. It was just dirt and rocks, but to me it was a library of stories. I thought about everything Dad had told me. I thought about the massive molars of Ouranopithecus, its powerful jaw, and the way it might have crunched on tough nuts and seeds in a world that was slowly turning drier. I thought about the smaller, leaf-eating Mesopithecus, swinging through the trees in the same forests. I imagined the great saber-toothed cats, their eyes glinting in the ancient sun, stalking their prey through the undergrowth. I pictured the shifting continents, the land bridges that were slowly disappearing, and the isolated populations of apes in Africa starting their own incredible journey toward bipedalism. I realized that the story of Ouranopithecus wasn't a neat, finished thing. It was a story with missing pages and debated chapters. It was a story that was still being written, and it would continue to be written with every new fossil that was found, every new piece of evidence that was unearthed. It was a story that showed us that our own existence wasn't a given. It was a result of a million different factors: a changing climate, a shifting landscape, a series of lucky breaks and clever adaptations. It was a story of survival. Dad came outside and found me there, just standing and staring. He didn't say anything, just stood beside me and put his hand on my shoulder. We stood in silence for a few minutes, watching the sun rise higher and higher until the world was bathed in a golden light. "Ready to go home, buddy?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, but I knew I wasn't really leaving. The stories of Ouranopithecus, of the ancient giraffes and the saber-toothed cats, of the changing world and the incredible journey of our own ancestors, were now a part of me. They were a part of the way I saw the world, and I knew that no matter where I went or what I did, I would always carry a little piece of that dusty Greek hill, a little piece of that ancient world inside me. I was a time traveler now, and the past was no longer just history. It was a living, breathing story that was all around me, just waiting for me to listen.